Okay, so I'm really so thrilled actually to be talking with you today, Cece. And your work on working with how you can deal with addictions is very inspiring. Um, I'm not sure why it's so inspiring. I have a curiosity. I have a feeling that it's because what I'm picking up from what I've heard you say before in other places is that everything comes down to the relationship that we might have with parts. And I'm sort of there's this hope that I have that if we were to hear you talking about this, we would get some insight into how if a person can build or form, I don't know, your words, not mine, some kind of relationship with a part that's positive, it can intervene, it can affect this trauma that comes that forms an addiction, but also is the addiction as a trauma, an ongoing trauma. So tonight or tonight for me in Italy, and you're in America, it's your afternoon.
Right.
That's really what I'd like to ask you about. What do you mean by relationship to one's parts or part? What is that?
Well, thanks for having me, Helen, and what a great place to start. And I love that out of whatever you have heard or seen that I have talked about or written about addictions, that the word relationship stands out to you. That's delightful to me. Um, boy, I'm not sure how I want to define the word relationship in and of itself, but we might think about just the relationships in the inner world is quite similar with the same kind of challenges and benefits as relationships in the external world, a relationship between you and I, you and your family, me and my family, our loved ones, our friends. So what happens in what do we consider a good relationship? What do we consider not such a great relationship? What creates a good relationship? So if we think about those what creates troubled relationships, what does that look like? So there's not one view of that, but the idea being that when we are working with our inner world and making a connection to different parts of our personality and forming those connections, that those connections, a healthy, kind connection to parts of ourselves grows us, improves us, develops us.
But it's not easy. This is this is the thing, the trouble, the puzzle, to form a relationship to a part that may not want to speak to you because it doesn't trust you. I'm using the IFS framework, I think, to sort of frame that. How can you form a relationship to a part that doesn't want a relationship because it doesn't feel that you're up to it or you're worthy of it? You know, it has grown to abhor or dislike or deny the possibility of a relationship. And yet the key to you healing and that relationship thing being of any benefit in the first place is that you create a relationship. So it's sort of like a catch-22. And how do you get out of that?
Well, I guess there's a couple of things I want to say to that, which is usually, for instance, if I'm working with a firefighter part or a distractor part, a soother part, a part that's trying to help the person get away from difficulties and stress and pain. If I'm building relationship and they say they don't like me or trust me, they don't know self. They're very familiar with, for instance, the managers in the system, the primary relationships in an active, addictive process, inner world, are between managers that are trying to control and stabilize and firefighters that are trying to get away and escape and relieve pain. So the firefighters often might perhaps don't know self. So they say, I don't know you, I don't like you, but they often, who they don't like are the parts they're usually in relationship with is their managers. So that's one piece of this. Same with managers that are very chronic and controlling and trying to get a hold and stabilize the system. They say, well, I don't like you, and they confuse the you with the parts of the person that are trying to escape and avoid pain. So a lot of the inner confusion is helping the parts know who they're talking to in the first place. And so I'm blending the client so they know who they're talking to.
So in that sense, it's a case of not desiring a primary relationship with who you know best. It's like a confused or wrong-headed primary relationship. Is that what you mean?
Well, I would say that the relationship, for instance, in an actively stressed system, stressed by addictive processes, is there's very little self present. So the parts are in polarities between each other. They are very fearful of exiles. When shame or worthlessness comes up, they quickly try to get away from it, or hide it or push it back down. So that those are all sort of, we might call them unhealthy relationships, or certainly unhelpful and ineffective. The parts are stuck in very old patterns. It'd be similar to, in family systems, which, Dick Schwartz, of course, was initially trained in family systems. That's his his doctorate. And classic family therapy, which my triangle is related to that, is if in a traditional family, if parent A or dad says A and the other parent says B, what does child do? C, whatever they want. In an inner world, if the managers say A, get in control, and the firefighters say B, get away, what do the exiles do? They have no attention, they're neglected, and they're re-burdened by the constant conflict between these two parts.
So is the job then to, well, not just to form healthy relationship? I mean, I guess these parts, the ones that have the firefighting roles, the manager roles, they're not going to disappear. They're not going to be kind of dissolved, because that's not how it works. They will get their new jobs, or whatever happens, there'll be a happier part of the system. So a relationship will form at some point with those parts, rather than sort of throw them in the bin. But the job is to have healthy relationships. But it sounds like the key to achieving that is somehow to get peace. Is that what you mean?
No, I wouldn't say it's to achieve peace. It's to achieve clarity. So that the essential form of regulation and intervention in IFS is unblending, which is helping a client identify what part or what emotional state or body state they're experiencing, help them identify that. And in identifying with it, detaching from it essentially, and building a relationship with it. When we call it a part, it's so brilliant, really. It becomes other. And when it's not us, but other, we can build a relationship with it. So the idea of building capacity to notice, to a sensation or a thought or emotion as it sort of crosses our path, to learn to focus on it. We say find it, and we say focus on it. Then we say befriend it, check into it, and see how we're feeling toward it, which is a diagnostic question. How do you feel toward it? That checks if there's some self-energy present, which is some level of calm or curiosity, or it reveals the presence of another part. So my goal with my client isn't for them to have peace. It might be an end result, of course. They'll have more inner peace and more sense of peace within their system. My goal is to help them identify and build connection.
So to do that then is, I mean, because I've heard often that, gang warfare, violence of a sort of a spontaneous, difficult kind, well, all violence is difficult, but of you wish it hadn't been so hot-headed and so on, is often linked to people feeling a lack of respect from another person. And are you talking about parts within the inner world, parts with whom one would wish that there was more harmony, there was more relationship, that what needs to be introduced somehow is more respectful distance. And I emphasize the word respectful. So they're doing forms of violence to each other. They're ignoring each other. They're hurting each other. They're disagreeing with each other without listening properly or taking into account each other's point of view. And I'm talking about parts in polarity there. And you know, I said the word peace, but it does sound like on the peace might be an outcome, but the key could be respectful distance between parts, so that what you just said earlier, this positive relationship can form, because the part is other, and you can only see the other if it is at a certain distance from you. Otherwise, you know, you have blended, you're blinded.
Right. So, yes, I mean, part of it is to detach, will be to send a certain amount of distance, knowing to distinguish between the self, which is the ability to sort of kindly witness, and the parts, the various parts. I think to respect a part, to learn more about it and respect its positive intentions is very, very helpful. So we would say in your example about someone who acts out violently, that they may say that they don't feel respected. We would also say that person, the violent parts of them, are protecting them from their own vulnerability and whatever it's been like for them to be invisible or not seen, or to have gone through various losses and traumas that were never tended to, that they've never had help with. So they're exiles, in other words. So that they are a complex person. They have firefighters, they have managers at other times, and they have exiles underneath and behind those protectors. So that's would be true for a teenager that involved in some violence, that there's lots of trauma behind that, and exiles that have never been tended to. And the same is in the inner world.
There's so much literature on the effect of solitude and silence when it's enforced, and being without a network of family and friends. You know, that has huge implications for people's life quality, but also, you know, longevity, in terms of health indicators and so on. And so, for example, the research on equality in societies makes a huge difference to various measures of well-being. You know, if some people are rich and they're happily surrounded by all the things that they need, and other people are neglected and lonely and poor, then, you know, there's a huge difference in those people's life quality and ability to live well, right? In terms of how long they might live. And is this the same in the inner world, that we need the respect, and this is a fundamental, it's a primal respect that we're talking about here. We need the respect of parts being given attention, being brought into a community, being respected as, and here we're touching on the idea of parts as people, you know, people are individual personalities, that you cannot expect a part to thrive and to, in inverted commas, behave itself or be part of a harmonious family, in a family network, if there is not the respect that that part is a kind of a person that deserves basic things like community, connection, being talked to, and so
on. Absolutely. So that we know that in order for children to grow and properly develop body, mind, and spirit, intellectually and emotionally, they need relationship. We're hardwired to need interaction to do that. And in the inner world, to build the ability to pay attention and attune with interest and kindness towards our own inner experiences, towards the parts of us that hold old memories, towards the parts that are engaged in various tasks, is a very key process. And those relationships build over time. I say, in relationship to one of your questions earlier around trust, I say to my clients, tell those parts, they say, I don't trust you. You say, I know, you hardly know me. Trust takes time. So these parts sort of have all these interactions with each other, but no sort of wise, calm presence with them. So they don't have a sense in self. They don't trust self. They don't think trust can calm and shut down the critics. They don't think trust is powerful enough to shut that down. They don't think trust self is strong enough to handle the firefighters. And I say to my clients, right, because they really haven't seen that yet. But what happens when you reflect to that part? I hear you. I hear your concern that I'm not here. I get that you don't know me. It's okay that you don't trust me. Of course you don't, but I'm listening, and we're going to develop this over time. So it's not an expectation that because I see you, we have a relationship. That also takes time.
Those comments that you were just modeling of what you might say to a part, these are the kinds of extremely respectful comments that people might say to people, and hope and expect also that things will calm down, that there will be some level of fruitful dialogue after people are shown that respect of, I do see you and I'm sorry, you know, the sort of apology thing. I'm sorry that I haven't spoken to you for 30 years or however long it might be that these parts have been neglected in the system. This curiosity is there though, which is, I don't know if it can be answered, and it's to do with the fact that any relationship in the outer world, if we're talking about humans, but also humans with animals, in fact with nature, you know, relationships in general with anything, right? The idea is that it's a human that's having the relationship, and that, but I shouldn't limit it. Starts from a notion of a person. You know, can, or an entity, a consciousness. Okay, so maybe animals definitely can have relationship with each other, but we assume that they have some level of consciousness in order to do that. And of course, it's the same with people. People have a consciousness that they love a certain individual, or they have a problem in a relationship with a certain individual. There's a spiritual aspect to that idea of the consciousness of the matter of the relationship that someone who is conscious can have with another consciousness, right? And this leads me to ask you, do you think that parts have consciousness?
Well, in a sense, yes. We say that all parts have a self, and that when they're struggling, they've been sort of forced by adapting to various circumstances in the person's life to take an extreme role in order to function. And so oftentimes when we connect to, for instance, I'll use an example of a firefighter part that's soothing, taking a lot of drugs and alcohol, and we listen to that part and we say, how are you trying? I invite the client to ask the part to show them, how are you trying to help me? You know, what are you afraid will happen if you don't help me get away this way or use this way? And the part will say things like, well, there's too much pain, or first I'm trying to get you away. I'm trying to take the edge off, or the edge off of what, you know. And firefighters have an awareness that managers are stressed, are caretaking too much, are controlling too much, are in constant stress of their own. So we might say that's the sort of the self of that firefighter. It knows that, even as it engages in extreme behavior. People often connect to very young parts of themselves that hold old memories. And even when children in real time, and these parts, they knew things about what was really happening in the family at the time. They didn't have words for it. They didn't have, as I say to those parts all the time, you knew what you needed. Let that little one know, she or he, they knew what they needed. They just couldn't get it. So I think often exiles know exactly what they need. They just don't have access to it or a way to get it. And so struggle and become quite burdened with beliefs about themselves. So there's an inner wisdom in parts that is really important to listen to. Critics might say, if I don't criticize you first, you know, someone else will come after you. So that's a pretty harsh method, but nevertheless, there's some wisdom in that, because that's actually happening in that person's life, or has happened.
That idea that parts can have or do have self, or put it another way, and it sort of functions similarly, consciousness of extremely complicated scenarios that are beyond their ability to cope with, but they're aware. Would you say, in your experience, which is so extensive, that I'm just going to briefly use that word respectful again, that respectful approach to parts having awareness of complexity, but being sort of children in essence in some way that can't cope with that such complexity, that a winning strategy to get respectful distance, unblend, to be respectful, you know, in a sort of humanitarian or humanizing way, is to speak to parts in a simple way, is speaking to parts in this simple, respectful, clear, clarifying manner, a way to get a successful relationship to them, given this is key to not changing their mind, but getting them on board a new approach, a less toxic or dysfunctional dynamic.
Yeah, I think respect is a lovely word. We have our 5 P's and our 6 C or our 8 C's, and I've added a 9th C of choice, and we have all kinds of stuff going on. But respect, I think, is really also a really appropriate word. And I would also say that if I were to break down what does respect mean, it means sort of an assumption that you have value. And it's starting out that each of those parts, no matter how extreme they have value. And it would be valuable to get to know them. So to model that, when I value my client, even though they're a mess, and I enter them into my relationship with my client with an assumption that they have a self, that even if they don't have much access to it currently or maybe ever, that it's there, and that I respect them, and that they're in this place because they're adapting to some really challenging circumstances. That level of respect establishes a beginning of our relationship, right? We don't have a relationship after hour 1, it develops over time. And the inner world is similar, it takes time, but when clients approach each part as having value. So this way, the basic assumptions of the model are that multiplicity is normal, that we all have it, and that parts are positively intended, which is to say they're adapting to something in the system, that they're trying to create function and balance, even if things are unbalanced.
But it's an extremely beautiful idea, but it's also a very practically useful idea if we're looking for healing and change in systems, as in people leading more flourishing lives. This premise, which is within IFS, given it suggests that people have parts themselves, that a person has value. Okay, some stuff has kind of got confused and things have gone haywire in the outer world, and they're not so great in the inner world either, or whatever might be going on. But at the heart of it all is this sort of, it's not just a hope, it's an assumption, it's a belief.
Yes.
That the person has value, right? And yes. That's so key. Is that, do you think, the key to beginning, and it is a long piece of work, just as it would be in the outer world, the forming of relationships, is that assumption that a part has value the beginning of the forming of the relationship? Because I think a lot of people do not assume that some people have value. So, they're not then going to assume that parts have value. You have to start in IFS or with IFS with the idea that this dysfunctional person that maybe has potential to heal has inherent value. It's a premise of you imagining that IFS could work for that dysfunctional person. And frankly, I'm putting everyone in the dysfunctional category in some way, shape, or form, right? Mm-hmm.
But we would say that in general, though, again, IFS has a very nuanced way of describing relationship and interactions. So if I were to rephrase what you're saying in parts language, I would say that parts of many people have parts that distrust other people for a variety of reasons. If we want to be political, we can look at a lot of the polarizations that exist in my country, in various political groups, etc. And we could spend a long time on that. So we would say, though, that person A has parts of them that have been socialized to be distrustful of people who are different. And many people have that socialization. And so in IFS, we would work with, so these parts learned to distrust this person, this thing, this situation. But that is not all of you. They are parts of you, even though they take up an enormous amount of space inside. So beginning to sort of
bit, the enormous amount of something, because
they take enormous amount of space inside, but it can. So I think that what can get in the way of creating that connection and beginning to work with people as those even huge distrustful parts, or parts that are socialized to hate or to be angry or to be distrustful of others. I think that hopelessness is probably one of the biggest, drags on that process, the sense that whoever they are, can't change. And that's the same in the inner world. Listen, I can even relate to it myself. I have certainly had times in my life, and I've been doing this model for, I don't know, 25 years or something. I can have a part that says, but is it really going to help this part of me? But what about that part of me? Is that really going to be different? I can have my own parts that will have doubt, or, I can work with that. I've worked with that over the years, but it's kind of normal to have some doubt. And if I always say, if you've grown up in a system where the people around you don't change, they get worse, not better. And you're maybe one of the only ones trying to get better. You have lots of parts that have earned their feelings of hopelessness about the world. Or I say hopelessness is about situations, and despair is about situations and the larger world. And yet, what if we call hopelessness a part, despair even a part, and we build relationship with it? And in that sense, listen to the hopelessness. Tell me how you became so helpless. What are you holding? Listen to despair. Tell me what you see. Tell me how it's impacting you. But in the ability to witness even these really, really painfully stuck, if you will, places, the model begins the process of some wiggle room. So I think fear and hopelessness are huge drags on creating relationship with other. But in this model, parts carry fears and parts carry hopelessness, and parts have been socialized to distrust.
Is it well, first of all, it sounds like it's possible to call respect a part. If you call fear a part, you could call respect a part. Is it possible to bypass a long-winded process of negotiating with the outer world, the inner world, and by privileging the part that is respect and saying, hey, let's step up. Let's respect all the parts, even the ones that are causing problems, the fear part, the despair part, the hopelessness part. And I know that IFS does do this. It does have respect for these parts. But could we go quickly to a very effective helpmate by bringing on board respect as a part and say, mate, you've got a big job. Because if you step up and respect not just these parts, but also the outer people parts, and their parts, then immediately and very quickly, there will be the flow of dialogue and the building of relationship. Do you think that respect, be it a part or whatever, has that power?
Well, no, because that's not how it works. We don't try to tell a part or a person, hey, take one of these good parts and just let this good part take over more space. I mean, we are a constraint releasing model. What we would say is, without parts, the person will naturally respect others. I don't have to teach myself to hold respect. I am not respectful because my parts are not respectful. So rather, I go in and say, tell me about your parts that hate. Tell me about your parts that are distrusting, right? This other part right now. And in the inner world, this happens all the time. And certainly with clients with addictive processes, there's tons and tons of distrust. Managers don't trust the chaos and the dysfunction that firefighters engage in, and firefighters don't trust managers to get what they're really trying to do, and that managers are going to handle all the emotional pain either. And so that, you know, I don't tell them, no, think of it. I mean, I would say they might be, I always say they're a little more complex than they look, but I work with that by welcoming the parts. How did you become distrustful? How did you get that? Tell me more about that. And when they're listened to, the distrust can soften. So it is the relationship that releases the more access to self, and from self, trust and respect emerge.
I suppose my question about the idea that I'm proposing of giving respect a really big role, and I do understand what you mean by this constraint release model, and the fact that there's this natural respect,
right.
you know, you don't have to create it by naming
right.
it as a part or anything like that. But
right.
I'm thinking of an example recently within my awareness, where there's a part that refuses to have a relationship with anybody, self, other, you know, doesn't really matter. This is a part that I guess in the IFS model it would be called an exile, but it refuses to come out of hiding. There's the sense of no relationship. You know, you've talked about these people who are distrustful and they don't like the other and what have you. And so there's a part without any relationship, desire whatsoever. But it's almost like a trick. Is it? Well, this is a question. Is it like a trick in that I can't think of a single example of anyone or anything that, if it is shown respect, does not have the ability, call it from self, to form a relationship of some minor kind. And when you're talking about ground zero, minor kind is a great start, right? You know, even if it's they look you in the eye, because,
of course,
you know, so
sure. Exiles have gone who have been exploited and neglected and abandoned repeatedly may often say, not being in relationship is the safest way for me to go. That would not be uncommon. And it's a wonderful strategy if the people around you are not safe, to say, well, then I just won't have any relationships. So the way to listen to that part would, from self, we would go in and listen and say, tell me how you learned that being alone is best and works best and is safest, and honor how that happened. And when you say if they initially say, I don't trust you, or I don't want to talk to you, we would, in essence, just hang out with them and say, of course you don't. And I'm sure you have so many reasons for not trusting someone like me. And yet at the same time, I want to keep coming because I am here and I believe that, you know, there's more to you than this, and I want to be with you. So you start to just let them be the way you are, and you don't have to trust me, and you don't have to like me, and you don't have to do anything. But how about, I'd like to still come back? And you might negotiate difference. I'll stand here and you can be there. But it would be a negotiation. But the idea being that from self, I'm not afraid of that. I'm not put off by that. I'm not discouraged by that lack of desire. I assume that lack of desire has a really powerful, important, significant story attached to it. And it makes perfect sense that the part doesn't want anything to do with anybody. But the essence of the relationship is that my willingness to be available. And I think availability is another piece that we are conveying when we show up for our parts.
But you're a therapist, and you know, a lot of people who I talk to are therapists, and that is wonderful to understand that there are people who are helping people, right? But obviously being a therapist is a job, and people who turn up to therapists, they can pay for the service, okay? And there is something that is really vital, which is how can people have the sort of the therapist relationship without having to pay for it, because they don't have any money to pay for it, and there's billions of people like that, right? So the question is it possible for them to intervene in their own system with the kinds of attitude that you're talking about, which you know, you must be aware, but it certainly stands out sort of drastically for me, because in my background is in alternative education, where there is choice, there is voice, and there is democratic equality. Okay, and you mentioned earlier this other C of choice, and you sound like a very democratic educator or interlocutor.
Let's hope so.
Yes, you do, and that is the respectful relationship inherent in those kinds of education, and it comes across as a very respectful approach to the fact that people might not choose to have a relationship with you because they've learned to distrust and so on. And so this respectful, voice-based, choice-based, and equalized platform that you create, is that something that people on an individual basis can do for themselves within? Because they're not going to get the help of a therapist. They just can't access that service and that support. So
I would say yes, and I mean, absolutely. You know, can you learn a model through video, through taking a course? You know, one of the things that IFS is expanding is just reaching out to the general public for their own growth and their own knowledge, you know. So it's another way that IFS is attempting to sort of reach out to the general public so that people can learn that. I think in general, it's great if you have someone to help you, have a pair, you know, if you're learning, you know, to do it with someone, with a friend, with a colleague, to learn, you know, to sort of practice on each other. There's things certainly that we can learn to do with ourselves that are really, really helpful. I think that there's things that we can learn to do in relationship that don't have to be in a clinical relationship, but we can learn to do them with our partner, do them with our friend, do them with our kids, perhaps certain sums of these. So I think that there are things that we can learn. There's ways in which IFS is just the language of it and the idea of it is extremely user friendly. I used to say that in the way beginning, before anyone had heard of IFS, they'd say, what is with the words like firefighter and manager? And it just didn't sound very sophisticated. You know, what kind of model is this? You know, and it just sounded so unsophisticated. I said, well, it's user friendly. Because it's the words, it's a language that emerged from client interaction. So I think that same user-friendly approach can be, we can use it with ourselves and we can use it in our social or emotional relationships if that's possible, and to grow that way. Yes, I think that's possible. The other thing I want to say is just a couple of years back, there's a huge organization of peer support in China. China doesn't specifically have psychotherapy as a profession, but there's a woman there, Helen, and I can't think of her last name. She's a completely lovely, brilliant woman. And she started a huge organization of peer support that exists, you know, in China, and has, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people as part of her larger network. There's homework they do, there's practicing they do, it's all peer. And they learned about IFS. Dick went over there and taught. Paul Ginter, another lead trainer, went over and taught over there with them and a few other people. They came to the IFS conference maybe in 2019, sometime before the pandemic, and talked about it. And it was very, very powerful. And they were not using it in any way in a clinical setting. So I went on to teach for Helen. So I got to meet hundreds of people on this class. We did it at like 6 a.m, because whatever time it was there, you know, just teaching the process of IFS. It was really powerful, and none of these people were therapists. So I think it's really I say to people when we're in the training, you know, the concepts are easy. It's not hard to understand the idea. And you're already attracted to these concepts if you signed up for a training or you signed up for a workshop. It's sometimes something, it intuitively lands or resonates with you anyway. So you can learn more about the consequences. The real act is in the doing. So I do think IFS is really trying to expand the doing to all kinds of groups within schools and other places, to expand that kind of doing, because, you know, you're so right. Psychotherapy is something that is mostly for the privileged. And, you know, in community mental health, we've expanded to meet communities and community mental health therapists, which increases availability. But there's just so many ways that it will be great for people to learn. And I think that it's real possible.
So just as a final question, do you think that somebody coming to IFS for the first time, who's going to go on a journey of learning these concepts, which, as you say, are not rocket science, they're fairly easy to take on board and give a go to, would you say it's fair to say to the complete beginner or newbie, or, you know, discovery for the first time of IFS, that the heart of what works and how this model will work for them, and I don't want to lead you in this respect, is but this comes from what I picked up from your work, is form relationships within, without, but start within, and the ones out without will probably get better. But the key to this model, the key to your healing, is relationships in the inner world that are caring and attentive, and as you have modeled when you talk, they're voice-led, they're choice-led. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I think relationships are key. I say all the time, I'm not wanting to get attached to an outcome of sobriety, or necessarily, or an outcome of I will no longer do this or that for food. It's really okay to have a vision for how you want your life to look. But what I want to really work on is basically attaching to your parts. I believe that healing is the result of the connection. It's not a result of a contract I make with myself that then I try to meet. Those kinds of contracts are they don't take into account our emotions, and our needs, the needs of our emotions, and so are ultimately, without that, can't continue. I don't want to say they fail, but they can't succeed, or succeed well, or succeed without enormous stress. So what does success look like? And yes, I think it absolutely looks like increasing our relationships with ourselves. So many people get better in a relationship. They develop boundaries. They get more clear about who they are, and gradually some of their symptoms or their firefighters and managers soften over time. And it's from those inner relationships which impacts their ability to be in outer relationships as well. Impacts the way they talk to their partner, handle the stress at work, handle the despair of their family of origin. It's really, that's why I like to use the term addictive process, because I think healing is a process. It took time for that person to get stuck with substances or porn practices or gambling practices. It took time for that to happen. And it takes time for that to heal. And I want to respect that time and respect every step of the way as being growth. And every self-to-part interaction is a movement toward health, every single tiny one.
And what you're talking about in terms of taking time is to be respectful, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. And not to get attached to the outcome. Of course, we care that things get better, but so often someone will tell me that they're not better because they're still using this or that, or they're still taking this drug, even though they've gotten rid of their alcohol. And somehow they have this idea in their head that they're not better yet, even though their partnerships is better. They can talk to a mother that they haven't been able to speak to in years and not feel crazy. They've totally changed things. They're taking on new jobs at work. All of these things change. But the definition is, but has this changed? Has this changed? And that in and of itself is just, it's a parts-led definition of health, and of healing. And so
what do you mean by parts-led definition? I don't understand that.
only a part would say, I'm not better if I still do this and everything. I'm not getting better if I still do this and all of these other things are better. Only a part would discount that. Now we might say from self, I have parts still so sad that this is happening, or still so stressed that this is happening. But from self, I can see all the ways that I'm growing, moving, changing my inner relationships and my external relationships. External relationships are dependent on our inner relationships. So we start here. I say, talk about, I can't, this is happening in my marriage. That's happening when I speak to my brother. That's happening about my father. And I say, well, let's go here. What parts come up regarding them? If you have a relationship with your parts that are being impacted, then you're going to meet that relationship with more self energy, and new things will happen. So external is dependent on internal. So in IFS, the power, the empowerment is building in a relationship. That's empowering. And we can take that empowerment to whatever we're facing on the external world.
But does that mean then that relationships are formed if there's silent love rather than parts chattering about what's missing?
Well, we don't want to say either or, but yes, I understand what you're saying, that it's not just silent. We're listening, we're paying attention, we're in connection. But I know you're saying, yes, it's not just about making rules and writing things down. And it's really is very much about presence, respect, to use a word that you're using a lot today. Presence, respect, kindness, welcoming, and valuing the part, even as it looks pretty damaged, or even as it looks pretty damaging, or even as it looks very harsh, beginning from a place of it has value.
Thank you.
And that's how we begin to feel like I have value. What a concept.
Oh, that's very touching. What you're saying is very touching.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks for these lovely questions. You've made me think.